Hello, it's Amy, and I'm back with the memoirs of Jacques Casanova. The other night I made it to the end of chapter 4, so I'll be talking about chapters 2, 3, and 4 in this video. And I had a nice comment via social media from someone who had seen these videos, and they mentioned that they've come across this exact edition before, and they sort of confirm my suspicions that it is an abridged or an expunged edition. So, as I've been told, all the naughty bits are missing, but I don't mind. People enjoyed it for decades and decades, a couple hundred years before, well, not a couple hundred years, but over 100 years. People enjoyed this work for over 100 years. Before the unabridged, unexpunged version was published in English. So in a way, I'm enjoying the translation and the version that all the essayists and all the authors I've been reading, I'm enjoying the same version that they enjoyed. So certainly I could go out and I could buy, the latest edition, complete in its entirety, unexpunged. But I'm not going to. I'm going to continue reading this edition that has been, read and enjoyed by several generations, and I don't think it suffers from, the naughty bits being removed. I'm not sure how naughty those naughty bits would be. Probably not naughty by our standards, but there's a couple moments so far where, I would guess, knowing what I know about there being an unexpunged edition out there, where I would guess there was probably a little bit more content. For example, in chapter 1, where he talks about getting to know his host's sister and describing that sister as his first love, I would guess there might have been something more there. And then once again, in the next chapter here, and I want to make sure I get her name right. But yes, Lucy of Passaian is the title of chapter 2. And I'm assuming, in the unexpunged version, there might be some more details perhaps about his relationship with Lucy. Although maybe not, because as he describes this relationship, he's got some regrets for not going far enough with her. And so she is a maid who waits on him in a hotel or boarding house where he's gone to stay. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it. He's staying somewhere in a boarding situation, and he has a maid who's waiting on him. And he seems quite taken with her. It's indicated that he's flirting with her. He's, to use an antiquated term, he's making love to her and really drawing her in to the point where she has perhaps developed some expectations about where their relationship is going to go. Perhaps she's thinking, this man is going to ask me to marry him. But he doesn't. He heads off at the end of his stay there, knowing that he's going to return, I think, in a few months or the following year. And when he does return, she is no longer there, and he asks her parents, and it turns out she has run off with some other gentleman. And his regret here is that he's broken her heart in such a way that she's, immediately thrown herself at the next man who comes along. But he broke her heart in such a way that her reputation wasn't hurt. She wasn't sort of exposed to the cruelties of the world, because nothing happened between them in a sexual sense. And he makes a statement here that, that's the last time I'm going to, leave the spoils, as he says, leave the spoils for someone else, because he thinks, by not sleeping with her or not seducing her, that perhaps he's done, more harm to her than he would have if he had. Because if he had, she would have remained with her parents and perhaps gotten over that. Whereas now she's eloped with some man, and they have no idea where she is, or if she's being looked after, or what's going to become of her. But moving on from that, I'm not sure if we ever hear any more about Lucy, but moving on from that, He has some clerical inspirations, and that is the subject of chapter 3, where he returns to Venice to his grandmother and does a little bit of preaching, becomes acquaintances with a local abbey, and he preaches this really great sermon that everyone really loves, and he gets a little bit full of himself. And so he asks for the opportunity to preach a second sermon. But because, his head has ballooned so large and he thinks he's got this great talent and he doesn't need to, memorize or practice or write things out, he thinks he's just going to get up there and speak. But before he goes to give that sermon on the day, he's been having this nice lunch, he's had a little bit of alcohol, and so he's late for his own sermon. So he gets called away from this lunch where he's been drinking, basically being told, everyone in the church is waiting, you're supposed to be in the pulpit right now. They're wondering where you are. And so he rushes over, goes into the pulpit, and he does okay for the first part of his sermon, but then he gets a little bit flustered and he forgets where he's at, and he starts to repeat himself, and there's sort of murmurs going through the congregation, and people are looking at each other, and it's quite evident that they realize that he's lost his place in his own sermon, and that he's had a few drinks before coming, and so he flees in embarrassment. He's still relatively young in his teenage years at this time. But off he goes, and goes back to the city where he was before, to kind of pursue this different career. It's quite evident that he's not going to be the kind of churchman or this potential bishop in the future who's going to be giving these sermons. But off he goes. And he ends up upon the death of his grandmother. I think this is the next major point here. Upon the death of his grandmother, he ends up in the position where his grandmother's house is going to be, taken into possession. The furniture is going to be sold off. I wasn't entirely clear on why this was happening. It seemed to be either owned by somebody else, perhaps it was their inheritance, or his grandmother was in debt of some sort, and because she was now dead, it was being collected on. But regardless of the circumstance, he decides that, because some of this stuff belonged to his father who is deceased at this point too, because some of this furniture belonged to his father, he's going to sell it off to build up some capital for himself. That gets him in a little bit of trouble. And he ends up, getting locked out of the house by the sheriff, the local bailiff, who, locks up the doors, and he comes back to this man in the morning who is intending to, take the furniture and sell it to recoup what he's owed. And the relationship isn't entirely clear, because it's almost as though, this person who is selling the content and selling the house is also sort of in a benefactor role in some ways, because Casanova, he threatens to sue this man, saying, you had no right to bar me from my own home. It's not yours yet. You had no right. And I was forced to spend the night in a house of ill repute, as he said. So it's indicated that, he went to a brothel or something, which probably not the best for his reputation if he's intending to, enter and work in the church. But he makes an agreement not to press charges or sue, not to make a big fuss over it, with the understanding that he's going to, head off somewhere else and meet up with this bishop who's going to take him under his wing, because his mother is, has some sort of connections elsewhere. And I think he's headed off to Warsaw. He goes through a number of places, but he spends, a short period of time in this I forget exactly what it's called, but it seems to be like sort of a monastery type thing where monks and churchmen are staying. Dark hallways, cells, the idea that you're not supposed to enter another brother's cell after dark. Some other man kind of wanders into his cell at night when he himself is coming back from visiting someone else. They get in trouble. He gets flogged, and he ends up eventually in sort of this prison atmosphere. He has a little bit of revenge he wants to get. Not really important, I think. The threads of the story were a little bit fuzzy for me there because I was trying to figure out, exactly what's going on, why he's in trouble. But once again, not really important because what he ends up doing is taking his mother up on this offer to go and meet up with this bishop who's going to take him under his wing. And so he's got to head off to Rome to meet this bishop. And he doesn't have very much money. He pulls some sort of trick with, I think it's mercury or something. He ends up mixing lead with the mercury to make it of greater volume, which then he can sell as pure mercury to a druggist or a pharmacy of some sort. I'm not sure what they're doing with the mercury, but he kind of swindles his way into some more money, and then he meets up with this monk figure who is also headed to Rome. And so they head on foot together, but he realizes before too long that his companion is not a real churchman at all, and is in fact, stealing from people and swindling them and using this holy persona to get food and provisions from people. But they proceed on to Rome together, even though Casanova at a couple points wants nothing to do with him. But somehow they end up back together and going on to Rome. In Rome, he has instructions to, I think there's a couple different places. He kind of follows this man through a few different cities before finally connecting with him, where he finds this man to be a little bit of a pathetic figure. Who isn't really able to offer him much because he doesn't have much money himself. So instead, he is, put under the wing of another figure and ends up heading back to Rome, gets to meet the Pope, has another bit of an adventure where he helps a woman who's in love with another man. He helps her out of a difficulty. And he ends up, because of that difficulty, being politely asked to leave Rome. And so he heads off under the guise that he's been given orders to go to Constantinople. And that's where we left him, headed off to Constantinople. So far, not too many romantic entanglements. I'm sure that comes later on here. But so far, just a really interesting story. About these adventures that he's having in his youth. And the Bishop of Martorano, that is the title. I think this is chapter 4 here. But I think for the most part, the names aren't too important because there are so many characters coming and going. But yes, he goes to Salerno, Naples, and Rome. And there's some great illustrations here. This is a beautifully illustrated edition here. And so that is, it's not going to tell me who it is. It's just telling me that it's published by the publishers of this book. But we have on the tissue guard, this is called the Intrusion. And so that is when the young lady requesting his help kind of bursts into his chambers. And he wants to avoid her being found there because that, of course, is going to cause trouble for him. And so he convinces her to go and ask for help from the cardinal because the bishop of Martinero, the Bishop of Montenero, who was the sort of acquaintance or friend of his mother. His mother, who seems to be, you know, in Warsaw, so somewhere in Poland, living apart from her son. His mother appealed to the bishop to look after the interests of her son, of Casanova. That bishop, in turn, put him sort of under the, I wouldn't call it guardianship, because he is a young man. He's expected to look after himself. But he puts him under the guidance of this cardinal, and they get along quite well until this incident with the young lady, which leaves him needing to leave the city to avoid talk. The Cardinal Acquaviva, and he is headed off to Constantinople, and that's where we leave him at the end of chapter 4. And it's unclear whether in chapter 5 he's going to head off to Constantinople right away, or whether that's going to happen later. But chapter 6 is actually titled Constantinople and the Corfu. So I would assume he is eventually going to find himself in Constantinople. And later on, you know, the chapters are named after women, they are named after cities. It sounds like he ends up in Paris later on. And so I'm sort of gathering that, you know, his solar journey to Constantinople is really going to be the beginning of his adventures as an adult. Because up until this point, he's been a teenager. He's been kind of flying by the seat of his pants, relying on the goodwill of others to finance his education and to finance his attempts to find a path in life. But now, after being aided by the cardinal, he's kind of off on his own. And I think he's old enough at this point that he's going to be looking for the guidance of other people less and less. And it'll be exciting to read on here. So I hope you're enjoying these videos. I'll be back again shortly with a video on the next few chapters.